with the alarm bells that are ringing all over Washington. Signs that Donald Trump is rattled, and some Republicans are on edge. New York Times reporting that former Trump officials worried about Trump's behavior, rising pressure on Trump clearly with the economy and his jitters over re-election.
Any Jewish people that vote for a Democrat, I think it shows either a total lack of knowledge or great disloyalty.
Isn't that anti-Semitic?
No. It's only in your head. It's only anti-Semitic in your head.
So we're talking about indexing.
I'm not looking to do indexing.
I've been thinking about payroll taxes for a long time.
I'm not looking at a tax cut now. We don't need it. We can bring up background checks like we've never had before.
We have very, very strong background checks right now.
The Prime Minister's statement that it was absurd, it was an absurd idea, was nasty. You don't talk to the United States that way, at least under me. Excuse me. Somebody had to do it. I am the chosen one.
Trumpologists say this is all getting worse, that it looks wacky because it is increasingly wacky. And that's not just critics, it's also his own people. Reporting showing fewer aides around him willing or able to challenge him, much less restrain his more impulsive instincts. Which also may explain why, at least in fits and starts, some other conservatives are stepping up. Talk of an anti-Trump coalition on the right. Also, look over at the far right, where former Republican Congressman Joe Walsh, a Tea Party conservative, is kind of testing the waters for his own primary challenge to Trump, which could be different than moderates who've gone at Trump, say Mark Sanford or Bill Weld, who's already been running, because you have something different here. You have a tough-minded right-wing radio host talking about taking on Trump. And the political question is not whether Walsh would win the primary against the sitting president or become president himself. The political question is actually narrower. Could he knock half a point or a point off Donald Trump's support? Consider Donald Trump couldn't spare a single point in his narrow, like super narrow 2016 Electoral College path to the White House. Now take a listen to Mr. Walsh today.
Trump's a bully, and he's a coward. And the only way you beat a bully and you beat a coward is to expose them, is to punch them. The only way you primary Donald Trump and beat him is to expose him for the con man he is. I'd punch him every single day.
A lot of people felt that, look, it seems like Trump gets away with everything and his side forgives anything. But maybe getting punched every day would add up. Trump was punched by Michael Cohen, who some dismissed as a felon. He's being punched this week by Anthony Scaramucci, who many dismissed as a self-promoter. He's been getting punched in this primary race from Bill Weld, but many Republicans dismiss him as a Massachusetts moderate. Now tonight, you have Tea Partier Joe Walsh coming at Trump from the far right with very little to lose, and maybe at some point all the punches do add up. Consider these new numbers in an AP report that notes 62% of Americans disapprove of how Trump handles his job, and that Trump is, and let this sink in, quote, the only president whose rating has never been above 50% in the history of polling. That's not good. The AP also notes a drop down to 7 in 10 Republicans approving of Trump's handling of gun control policy. That's his lowest ratings on that issue from Republicans. So even on guns, Trump is losing 3 out of 10 of them. His newly vocal critics and conservative opponents seem to have something in common. They appear to be planning, whatever you think of their authenticity, they appear to be planning for a world where Donald Trump loses. They could be wrong. It's hard to beat an incumbent president. That's just a historical trend. But it's interesting because these nerves and the worries, they're not just coming from Trump insiders. It's spilling out also to some of his enablers and some of the most powerful people in Washington, like Mitch McConnell. The context here is you have 22 Republican seats up in 2020. Democrats need to get 3 or 4 to win back the Senate, which could explain something that you don't see every day and not usually in August. Mitch McConnell out here on this hot summer week with an op-ed that on its face fights to defend the rights of the minority in the Senate, which means advocating for a Senate tactic currently exercised by Democrats. Republicans control the Senate. Why is Mitch McConnell out here writing essays about this tool that his party doesn't need right now because they're in charge, that the senators in the Democratic Party need, the filibuster? Well, maybe he has something in common with those other people I just showed you, whether you think they're in it for themselves or not. Maybe Mitch McConnell is worried this is a tool Republicans will need soon if they face a rout in 2020. I'm joined tonight by New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg, Juanita Tolliver from the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and Amy Allison, president of the group Democracy in Color and the founder of She the People. Nice to see everybody.
Hey, Ari.
Juanita, do you sense a pattern?
I mean, yes. I think members of the GOP see a weakness here, especially as the conditions evolve related to the economy and the fact that almost 50% of Trump supporters from 2016 would blame Trump for that. So not only is Trump reacting, but I think that's where these external threats to his being primaried come from. You have Scaramucci setting up a PAC looking to shave off 5, 6, 7% of the vote, which could have an impact in a general. And then you have Walsh here also looking to run a primary where he's making a play to hold Trump accountable, something we have not seen done well from the GOP at all. So it'll be interesting to see how voters who just can't stomach supporting Trump, even though they're Republicans, react to that as an alternative.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that these defections are going to weaken Trump so much as I think that these defections are a sign of Trump's growing weakness, right? I mean, they sort of either smell blood in the water or aren't willing to go down with this ship. And I think it has a lot to do. You know, it's hard for me to say whether Trump has become more erratic or more unhinged, because it's not like he was ever particularly
it's been pretty
hinged
steady
to begin with, right? I mean, he's never
Juanita, you agree with Michelle that he's been steadily unhinged?
It's been pretty steady. It's been pretty steady since he descended that golden escalator.
Right. I think he's always been erratic, inept. He's always been given to crazy conspiracy theories and wild hyperbole and racial insults. I think that maybe they could be getting worse, and it also could be being thrown into higher relief as his poll numbers go down, as the economy weakens, and as multifarious foreign policy crises that have been in the background have now all kind of are coming to fruition all at once, right? So that you can see the chaotic consequences of lack of American leadership all over the place.
That makes sense. Amy, there's also the issue of the fights that he picks. The beef with the Danish prime minister. Again, I take Juanita's point. There's always been really petty, stupid fights for no reason. Yet some of them, were with domestic political opponents and the press, which has some vibes that are similar to other political tricks. When you're beefing with these foreign leaders, I mean, they have their own power base. They have their own constituents. It doesn't necessarily end well. He was sort of punked by Denmark, which is why he's been so upset about it. And we were speaking just on this show with Barbara Rez, who used to work with him, about this. I asked her point blank, why he's so sensitive on these matters. Take a look. Is he a snowflake?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, yeah. He does the worst things, and then when somebody just does a little thing, how dare they? This is the United States they're insulting. I mean, it's ridiculous. He wasn't that bad then. People started thinking he was a little bit of a joke, but more later on, The Apprentice, I mean, that to me and many people he was like a cartoon at that point.
Amy?
Yeah, I think what we're looking at is a series of attempts by Trump, kind of like test balloons, to see what's going to move his approval numbers. I mean, remember, this is a guy, more than from business, he's from entertainment. He's trying to figure out how to save himself. All those the talk about cutting payroll taxes, which he rescinded, and attacking a woman leader of a European country, which, he's being outfoxed and outclassed right and left. The only playbook that really works with his base is racism and sexism. We're going to see him come back to that again and again in his attacks. It's a organizing, coordinating principle in his campaign. And I think the GOP and Joe Walsh trying to run from the right, have at it. They say death by 1,000 cuts is an effective way to do things. It demonstrates Trump's weakness. But I'm really interested in what everyone else is doing, how they're responding. We can be whiplashed and try to follow the non-logic of an increasingly bizarre behavior of a guy in the White House, or we can organize our own troops and our own forces with a clear message. And I think, I'm looking at the Democrats and I'm looking at the organizers on the ground and saying, how are they taking advantage of the moment, the fact that there's so much chaos coming from the White House and no one seems to be able to quell it? He's also enjoyed great benefit from having almost universal blocking and protection on the part of the GOP. And I'm really looking at the Democrats to hold not only Trump, but all the rest of the Republicans accountable for, the crimes and the activities and the misbehaviors that they have protected.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned also the sexism and racism that he reaches towards. Juanita, the fights, that he sort of improvises his way in. So I'm not sure how familiar he was with the political leadership of Denmark when he was hunting for Greenland.
Or foreign relations in general, right?
But then he figures out, he's dealing with a female head of state, a powerful woman, and he does what he's done at other times. We put this together. Take a look.
The Prime Minister's statement that it was absurd, it was an absurd idea, it was nasty.
I think she's a disgrace. She's a nasty, vindictive, horrible person.
She said she'd move to Canada if you got elected.
What can I say? No, I didn't know that she was nasty.
What we want to do is to replenish the Social Security Trust Fund.
Juanita.
I mean, it's the playbook, right? He's pulling out all of his sexism and misogyny, putting it on full display for his base to be reacting to. But here's the thing. While we're talking about Greenland, while we're talking about him being the chosen one, we're not talking about all of the things that are happening in the news cycle and impacting our economy, like the fact that the U.S. deficit is soaring because of his trade deal, like the fact that the coal industry was downgraded by Moody yesterday to negative. And so you have coal miners who voted for him in 2016 looking like this is another broken promise. You're not looking out for me. I'm fighting to live. What are you doing for me? And he's going to be having to find an answer that is going to make sense to those folks who supported him in 2016, because deflection is one thing, but when you have nothing to show but a long list of broken promises on taxes that did nothing for American workers, but everything for corporations and the wealthy, on health care, which Trump is actively trying to take away people's care, especially individuals living with pre-existing conditions right now, as well as on jobs, when you have folks in the auto industry who are jobless right now because those factories did leave the country. He has nothing to show for himself. So sure, use the playbook, but I'm not sure it's going to get him very far.
Juanita and Amy, thanks to both of you for joining us tonight. Michelle Goldberg stays. I want to do one more thing and get into it with you, which is Mr. Walsh. They talk about defining deviancy down. It is striking that I don't think anyone would have expected 5 years ago, including people on the political right, that Joe Walsh would be, according to at least some conservatives, the more reasonable savior against Donald Trump, or at least would be the tool. And so while we're mentioning this, and as you said, it may reflect the weakness that people see out there, we would be remiss if we didn't also hold Mr. Walsh accountable for his own statements because of everything he's been through. So as he becomes the next potential Republican foe of Donald Trump, at least in the media sphere, and we know Trump doesn't like it when people go out there and say this stuff on TV. Here is some of what is Joe Walsh. Take a look.
You know what, Mr. President? A moat might not be a bad idea, and I wonder how many of these alligators it would take to secure the border.
If I wanted people to take up arms, why would I recommend people take up an antique like a musket? I mean, seriously, in 2016, I want people to go out and find a musket.
They want the Hispanic vote. They want Hispanics to be dependent upon government, just like they got African Americans dependent upon government.
Is he a contrast to Trump, or is he just sort of another Trump?
Well, I think it's important to look. I'm not going to vote for Joe Walsh.
Hold on,
right?
Michelle. I thought you were going to vote for Joe Walsh.
But I think it's important to note, first of all, that he has, and take it for what you will, but he has apologized for the role that he played in introducing a Trump-like politics into the United States, right? So that, I think, already gives him moral authority over Trump, which is not necessarily saying that much. And so I think that the reason that he is a possible contrast to Trump, or at least a possible foil to Trump, is because he clearly does share the same underlying commitments. And I think I've said this on your show before, that often people who become defectors from a movement are the ones who are true believers. It's the true believers that feel truly disappointed and truly betrayed when the ideals of the movement that they were part of turn out to be aren't lived up to, right? So that's why you see somebody like Justin Amash, who was very, very conservative, become the only person to leave the Republican Party in Congress over Trump, right? That's why Mark Sanford is extremely conservative. Jeff Flake was one of the most conservative senators and was a kind of Tea Party darling before he got on the wrong side of Trump. So in a way, it's the people who care enough about the purported ideals of the conservative movement to blanch when they're betrayed that are going to launch a challenge to Trump.
Well, and I think you just put your fingers on something that's important, which is for all the energy of the resistance, which has a lot of, as you put it, a moral dimension. It isn't enough to just tell the people who support Donald Trump, he's the worst, and you're late. That's not a winning coalition building strategy, right? And so the Democrats have to figure out, if part of the argument is that he's a con, how do you tell people that without insulting them because it suggests they've been conned?
I think that he's a con, and says, the corollary of that is that you had a right to expect better.
Right, and there's broken promises. Michelle, always good to have you for multiple topics. Thanks for being here. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.